Hi there guys, got a video here for you today on the FX DRS, and what we're going to be doing in this video is tearing the rifle down. Now I want to have a look inside the rifle just to see if I can spot anything that's given us our accuracy issues. If you've seen my overview on the DRS, you'll know that this particular rifle isn't the most accurate thing in the world, and I'm wondering if there's something in the block or maybe in the barrel that's given us a little bit of trouble. Now, I haven't had this particular rifle fully in bits yet, but I have had a look at the exploded diagram on the FX website, and it looks very similar to the Crown and the Dreamline, so hopefully the block should be fairly familiar and won't cause us too many problems. Before we begin on the work though, we do need to make sure that the rifle's safe to work on, and the way that we do that is by cocking the rifle, removing our magazine or single shot loader, then pushing the bolt forward and firing the rifle into a nice safe backstop. I have already done this just to save us a little bit of time, and I have already removed all the air from inside the rifle. I'll show you how I did that. First of all, we're removing the stock, and that's done by loosening this bolt in the bottom using a 4mm Allen key. With that removed, the stock can be just lifted up and put nice and safely over to one side. Up next, if we flip the action over, I'm going to be removing my little gauge cover on the side here. And to degas the rifle, all I did was use an adjustable spanner and then crack the gauge loose. It did take a few turns for the gauge to actually start leaking, and that's because there's an X-ring under the gauge and it likes to stay sealed. So if you do loosen the gauge to remove the air from the rifle, just go nice and slowly, and as soon as you hear the rifle start to hiss, stop and let the rifle fully degas. And I will mention whilst we're here that loosening the gauge and removing it from the side of the rifle makes sure that there's no air left inside the cylinder. However, it does not guarantee that there's not still air trapped inside the plenum. So to remove that, what I would do then is just dry fire the rifle and make sure we have no air escaping from the barrel. I've already done that though on this rifle, so the next thing we'll do is remove the scope rail by loosening these 3 bolts here. I will mention that this is an optional accessory, so the standard rifle won't be fitted with this piece, but I've gone ahead and fitted it to this rifle. And we're removing these screws by the use of a 2mm Allen key. Once they're all removed, we can just slide the Picatinny rail off the dovetail, and we're ready to remove the shroud. And to do that, all we need to do is unscrew it, and then slide that off the barrel. As you can already tell, the air cylinder on this particular rifle is around the barrel, and if we look in the end of the shroud, we do have this removable end cap. If you don't have a specialised pin tool, you can just put a couple of M4 bolts in the end there, then unscrew it. It may be a little tight, so you might need to get an Allen key or something similar between the bolts to loosen it, but that's a simple way of removing the end cap without having to buy a specialist tool. With that done, we've exposed a few O-rings, so I'll just go through the purpose of them. We have one on this end here, and that seals on the inside of the cylinder, so if you have air leaking between the joint of the cylinder and the joint of the block in this area here, it's more than likely going to be that O-ring there. The same can be said at the other end. This has an O-ring here, and that seals off the joint between the front of the air cylinder and the boss here. We do also have an internal O-ring there, and that seals around the end of the barrel and keeps air in this section of the barrel here. There's another O-ring inside the block which seals on this end of the barrel, but I'll get you a look at that in a minute. If this O-ring here has failed, you'll have air leaking out of the end of the shroud. With that done, we'll put these bits over to one side, and then like most FX rifles, if you wanted to remove the liner, you would simply loosen the jam nut, and that's done by using a 10mm Allen key, just like so. Then that exposes the liner in the end there. If we wanted to, we could pull that out at the moment, but I'm just going to be leaving it in place for now. And we are just going to be removing the entire barrel assembly from the block That's done by loosening the 2 retention screws, one on either side, and that's done using a 2mm Allen key. From the factory, these ones did have a small amount of Loctite on them, so just be aware of that as you remove them. And from the factory, there was another grub screw in the top here, but I've already removed that as I fitted the new top rail. With those 2 grub screws removed, we should be able to just pull the barrel out the end, and there we have the transfer port end of the barrel. This obviously does still have a transfer port O-ring. Not quite sure if the camera will pick it up, but you should be able to see it just in the end there. And that seals off air from escaping around the pellet probe when we fire the rifle. So if you have air leaking out of the transfer port area every time you fire the rifle, that's probably one of the O-rings you need to change. Right then, so with the air cylinder and the barrel removed, we can start disassembling the main block. Before we get into that though, I just did want to give you a quick look inside the throat here, and to show you the O-ring that I was talking about earlier. So hopefully with the torch you may be able to see the O-ring just beneath that little step there. I'm not quite sure if the camera will pick it up, but past that step there is an O-ring. This O-ring seals around this end of the barrel, somewhere around here. We also do have another 2 O-rings just past the pellet probe. So you can see the one at the end there. There's another one somewhere around here inside the block, and those 2 O-rings seal around the transfer port where I have these 2 marks here. So the one at the front of the block that seals around the barrel is a permanent sealing O-ring, and if this one has failed, you probably have air leaking through the screw holes here, here, or here. The other 2 are non-permanent sealing O-rings, so if you feel air or a puff of air every time you take a shot, it may be worth replacing the 2 in the block. FX guns are normally pretty good. You can find all of the O-ring sizes on their website. They have a little download section where they list all the parts. With that said, next thing we're going to remove is the plenum, and that's held on by these 4 screws here, so we can loosen them using a 3mm Allen key. With those off, we have an O-ring around the base here, and then the plenum. So this is a sub 12 pound plenum, and as you can see here, this is just a block of aluminium. There's no drillings or anything like that in it. So the O-ring just seals on this flat section here. The FAC ones do have a larger plenum that's drilled out, so you have plenum volume in the bottom there. But there is a small O-ring on the base of the unit. So that's just this O-ring here. That O-ring seals the joint between the plenum and the block, and if you have air leaking out of the joint of these 2 components here, it's most likely going to be that O-ring. With that done, we'll put this to one side and remove the valve. So the valve on this particular rifle should be under this cap here. To remove the cap, what I'm going to be using is a pair of snap ring pliers. And on this particular rifle, this valve cap wasn't done up tight at all. Actually, it was fairly loose. So it was about there when we first took it apart. So it's about half a turn or a quarter of a turn loose. Right then, as we undone that was fairly loose. That is the valve cap, so I don't think it's supposed to be loose. But when the rifle's pressurized up, air pressure is always going to be wanting to force this valve cap off. So I doubt it would have come loose of its own accord, and it is held captive by the cylinder when the cylinder is installed. But the other thing we removed was the valve return spring, and then this little Delrin spacer piece here, and that's just a spring guide for the back there. So in the rifle, that'd be assembled something like that. The next thing we can remove is the valve pin, which is still in the rifle, and to remove that, I'm just going to be using some nice needle nose pliers. So there we have it. There's the valve. The valve seat looks to be still in the rifle. Now, I haven't made myself up a full set of tools yet, but I'm pretty sure we can push the valve out from the hammer spring side. So when we remove the hammer and the hammer spring, we should be able to push the valve out. Up next we'll remove the regulator, and this is a standard sub 12-pound rifle, so it does have the small black cap in the end there to stop you adjusting the regulator pressure. There's a few ways to remove these. What I like to do is take a nice sharp pointy thing, push that into the side of the plastic puck nice and firmly, and then lever the piece out. Generally speaking, you'll pierce the side of the plastic, and then you'll be able to lever the plastic out of the regulator adjuster. And there we have it. So there's the little puck there. With that removed, we can just remove the regulator like a standard AMP regulator. To begin with, we're going to be removing the adjuster screw using a 2.5mm Allen key. That's just that one there. Then we can use a 5mm Allen key to remove the body. And on this particular regulator, the piston came out with the body. Generally speaking, the end of the piston is slightly dished, so the piston itself should stay retained within the body. The regulator itself seems to be the new style of AMP, so it has the 4 holes around the outer diameter of the body, and then the piston itself is the brass one with the Delrin tip. So there we have it there. You can see my standard Belleville stack. And for anyone interested, the Belleville washers are 10mm in diameter, as is the body, or just over. So there we have it. So it seems to be the standard AMP regulator. And as always, there is always a body O-ring that's present inside the block. So I'm not quite sure if the camera will pick it up, but just past the threads, hopefully you can see it there. But there is a small O-ring that seals around the outside diameter of the body, so around this smooth section here. You do have a few O-rings on the regulator, so I'll just briefly explain what they do. You have an atmospheric bleed hole in the side of the block here, and that connects to the Belleville chamber. The Belleville chamber should never be pressurized, and if air is leaking out of this hole here, it will be one of a few O-rings. Firstly, it can be this one at the bottom of the piston. Second, it can be this one in the end of the regulator body. And thirdly, it could be the body O-ring itself, so the O-ring that's present within the block. We have an O-ring around the top of the body here, and if that one's failed, you'll just see air leaking out from the joint between the body and the front of the block. We have 2 O-rings on the adjuster screw. If this bottom one has failed, you'll get excessive amounts of regulator creep, and if this top one has failed, you'll get air leaking out of the thread joint between the adjuster screw and the body, so around this area here. The final seal is a mechanical seal between the top of the piston and the bottom of the adjuster screw, so when in the rifle and the rifle is pressurized, the piston is pressed up against the face of the adjuster screw there, and air can't pass through the regulator. As we take a shot, that de-seats and allows air from the cylinder pressure side to enter the plenum, and then once the plenum reaches our set reg pressure, that closes just like that and stops air from moving forward. If the seal between these 2 components isn't very good, you'll get excessive amounts of regulator creep. With that said, we'll put that to one side, and then remove the final part of the front section of the block here. And that's just this screw at the front. This should just be a blanking plate. So that has a small O-ring on the base of that component there, and we will remove that just using a 3mm Allen key. There is a piston in the base there as well, so we'll just knock that out. And then there is still a small O-ring left in the body of the rifle. Just getting that out like so. This seals around this shaft here. And these 2 O-rings here just seal off an internal drilling between the valve and the regulator. Next up, we can just remove the mechanical side of the action, starting with the trigger. To do that, the first thing we're going to remove is these 3 grub screws here, which secure the trigger pins. That's done using a 1.5mm Allen key to remove the grub screws. And once all of those are out, we can push out the trigger pins. Starting off with this one here, we're going to be pushing this out using a 1mm drill bit. And as we push this out, we're just going to keep a firm grip of the trigger, as there is a small spring beneath it. So there's the first trigger pin removed, and that allows us to pull the trigger out. So it's the standard FX style trigger, second stage at the back here, which is this screw here, trigger return spring, as well as the Pac-Man wheel, so this part here. This one at the back is your safety adjustment screw, this one at the front is your first stage adjustment screw. The next pin, this one here, is just an over travel prevention for the sear, so it stops the sear from dropping down too far and becoming jammed in the action. And then the third pin here just secures the trigger sear into the block. With that removed, we can tip the block up and then tip out the sear itself. If we take a look at the sear, it looks to be the same one that's in the FX Pantera. And there is a fairly large amount of brass debris within the action. I'm guessing that's from the hammer spring adjuster, which is just that piece there. So I'm probably going to clean all of that off camera. With the trigger removed, we can now remove the hammer spring and hammer spring adjuster. First thing we're going to remove is the hammer spring adjuster in the back here, and that's done using a 4mm Allen key. If you wanted to, you could, before you remove the hammer spring adjuster, you could take the measurement between the back face here and the top of the adjuster screw, just so you can reset it when you go to rebuild your rifle. I'm going to be doing a full retune on this rifle, so it doesn't really matter to me. But there we have the hammer spring, the adjuster, and then what looks to be a small power washer on the back there. So I'm guessing the brass debris that we saw from the trigger sear is just where the spring is rubbing on this section of the adjuster. But not to worry. We can then tip the hammer out. And again, the hammer looks to be the same one that's in the Pantera, although there is a small amount of brass debris along the hammerway itself. So there we have it. If we take a quick look inside the block, you can see the hammer well there. And I'm not quite sure if the camera will pick it up or not, but you can also see the back of the valve seat in the bottom there. It's a small silver piece, so we can push it out from this side. I'm going to do that by just using an old Allen key, being nice and careful, pushing on the silver part, then pushing it through the front of the block. And if we take a look through the block, you can also see that the valve chamber is offset from the hammerway. But with that done, that's the hammer and the hammer spring removed, as well as the valve seat. So when that's in the rifle like so, that's assembled just like that. Put that to one side, and I'll bring back some of the valve components and just explain all the different O-rings. Right then, so the valve assembly itself has 3 O-rings as well as a mechanical seal between the valve seat and the valve pin. This O-ring at the back here seals off these threads so that regulator pressure cannot escape to atmosphere, and if that one's failed, you'll see air leaking through this hole here. These 2 O-rings, so the one on the external diameter here as well as one on the internal diameter around the valve pin, are non-permanent sealing O-rings, so these 2 O-rings here only see pressure when the rifle is fired. If either of these 2 O-rings here have failed, you probably see that the rifle drops in power and you may experience some inconsistency problems. The final seal between the valve seat and the dell rim part of the valve is a permanent seal, and if this seal has failed, you'll have air leaking out of the end of the barrel. So I'll get you a quick look at all those components, nice and close up. That's the external seal, that's the internal one, and that seals around this diameter here. We have the valve itself, and that seals on this outer edge here. So when that all goes together, you can see how that works. That's how the valve is when the rifle is pressurized and we're ready to take a shot. When we fire the rifle, the hammer hits the end of the valve, opens that up and allows air to flow through the valve, up through the transfer port and push a pellet out the end. Regulator pressure on the back of the valve, along with valve return spring pressure, closes the valve after the rifle's been shot. The other novel thing that I'll mention whilst we're here is that the valve isn't straight up and down like it is on most rifles. It's actually off to an angle like so. That is mirrored in the pellet probe as well, so when we get that out I'll be able to show you a little clearer, but when the valve is installed into the rifle, it's not straight up and down like that. It's slightly cocked off to the side, so that air can escape through the valve like so. That's done just to save a little bit of space in the block, as the valve and the regulator are side by side, so you can't have the valve in the middle. There wouldn't be enough room for the regulator. But the main benefit of a design like that is that you can keep the block nice and narrow, so you don't have to double stack the regulator and the valve. Right then, the last O-ring in the valve assembly is actually one I missed the first time around when I recorded this video, but luckily I caught it in the editing stage. The last O-ring is located in the block, and it seals around this part of the valve here. This O-ring stops pressure from bypassing the valve and just leaking out the end of the barrel. So if this one has failed, you'll have a consistent leak of air through the barrel. The O-ring itself is a little tricky to show on camera, but it's easily observed through this hole in the bottom of the rifle. If I take a light, hopefully you can see that there, but the O-ring is just center in the middle of the screen there. So if that O-ring has failed, air will be able to leak out through the barrel. With that done, we'll finish the block disassembly by removing the pellet probe and the cocking arm, and that's done by removing this grub screw in the back of the block. And there's our pin there. That's removed using a 1.5mm Allen key. With that removed, we can just slide the pellet probe out from the rear of the action. And as you can see there, or hopefully you'll be able to see, but the pellet probe is not straight, it's off to one side because of the valve arrangement I showed earlier. But there we have the pellet probe assembly. We can remove this section of the pellet probe if we want to by removing this grub screw here. Again, done by using a 1.5mm Allen key. This did have a small amount of Loctite on that from the factory. But with that removed, we can just remove the pellet probe. It does look to be the same one that's in the Dreamline series of rifles. But there we have it. The last thing we'll do is just remove the very last parts of the block. Nothing really that interesting from here, but we can remove the safety, this cover screw here, as well as the pellet probe detemp. We'll start off with this grub screw here, and this is just a blanking plate to cover the drilling between the transfer port in the end of the block here and the valve. And as you can see, that's done at an angle to match the angle of the valve. There we have it. It did have a small amount of sealant around it. The detent for the pellet probe, or the cocking arm I should say, is at the back here. That can be removed using a 2mm Allen key. And again, small amount of Loctite on that component there. That's just a small captive ball inside the end of a grub screw. It just gives you your lockback detent for your pellet probe. The last thing we'll remove is the safety bar, and there is a small spring and a ball bearing beneath this, so if you do end up having to remove this, just do it nice and carefully. To begin with, we'll remove the arm, and that's done by flipping it over, installing a 1.5mm Allen key into this hole here, and then loosening the grub screw. We just need to loosen this, we don't need to remove it. That allows us to remove this pin here. Then we can push this section out, and it comes out through this side here. Before we push that out though, we are just going to align this hole here with the side of the rifle, or the rear of the rifle I should say. So there's the hole there's the rear of the rifle, and then just make sure this cutout is misaligned with this section of the rifle here. Once we're happy, we can just push the bar out. And as you do this, as you get to this part here, just be nice and careful. What I like to do is flip the block over, put my finger over this hole here, then remove the bar. So there's the ball bearing. And then the small spring will be in this hole here. Right then, so there's the DRS fully disassembled. I've just laid out most of the components here. As you can see, not that many parts to this particular rifle. Few grub screws, bits and pieces here and there, but overall, not a complicated rifle whatsoever. Overall, I'm really quite happy with the quality of the components. I think everything looks and feels really quite good. I found no major issues with the rifle whatsoever. We did have a little bit of brass swarf in the action from the spring rubbing against the hammer spring guide here, but that's not a big problem, I can clean that out. The only two very minor things that I did find with this rifle, which could have been causing us a couple of accuracy issues, was the loose valve. So this is the valve cap here, and this was loose from the factory. So that could have been allowing a little bit of movement in the valve area. I'm not quite sure, I'll have to retest the rifle once that's tightened back up. The other thing I found was a small amount of delamination between the valve and the stem. So if I move the block, you may be able to see it, you may not. But there is a small gap between the Delrin seat and the valve stem itself. Now, I know valve stems are normally pretty critical when it comes to things like that, so that could have been causing us a little bit of an issue. However, that's pretty unlikely. I don't think either of these two issues here would be enough to cause major accuracy issues, and overall the rest of the parts of the rifle look fantastic, so I'm quite happy there. The rifle may just need a retune to suit the pellets that I'm shooting. The other thing I wanted to show you is I've removed the liner from the barrel. As you can see here, the liner is held in place by two O-rings, one at the front here and one at the back, and the liner itself is the new style with the laser engraving on it, although I think pretty much all the liners have this now. So there we have it. So with the DRS, what I think I'm going to do now is clean up all the components, rebuild the rifle, retune it, and then test it downrange once more. Hopefully a little bit of playing with the pellet speed and the regulator pressure, we should be able to improve the accuracy a little bit, but if that still doesn't fix the issue, I'm just going to slap a HFT 500 barrel on the rifle. With that said guys, that's going to do it for this video, so I hope it was interesting or useful. We'll see you in the next one.